2 weeks ago I told this channel I was going to test something I had seen described online as a Japanese 4-hour sleep method, a claim that sleeping in short, segmented blocks adding up to roughly 4 hours a night was a traditional practice that left people sharper, calmer, and more productive than a full night of sleep ever could. I want to be honest with you about something before I tell you what happened, because it matters more than the experiment itself. I could not find this method anywhere in actual Japanese sleep research, actual Japanese medical guidance, or any credible historical source. What I found instead was a viral claim, repeated across hundreds of videos, attributed to a culture that has never actually endorsed it. So this video is not the one I plan to make. It is the one I think you actually need, because what I found mattering more than my own 2 weeks of results was figuring out where this claim came from, and why it is wrong in a way that could genuinely hurt someone who tried to follow it the way I almost did. Let me start with what I actually did, because I want to be transparent about the experiment itself before I explain why I do not recommend it to anyone watching this. For 14 days, I restricted my total nightly sleep to roughly 4 hours, broken into 2 segments, based on the version of this claim that was most widely circulated. I tracked my sleep with a wearable device, kept a daily log of mood, focus, and physical symptoms, and stopped the experiment on day 11, 3 days earlier than planned, for reasons I will get to. I am walking you through this not as a method to copy, but as a record of what actually happens when ordinary sleep research collides with a viral wellness claim. The first thing to understand is what Japan's actual relationship with sleep looks like, because the real picture is almost the opposite of what the 4-hour claim suggests. Japan has one of the lowest average sleep durations among developed nations, a well-documented public health concern that the Japanese Ministry of Health has spent years actively trying to reverse, not promote. The cultural practice most associated with sleep in Japan is not a 4-hour method at all, it is Inemuri, a recognized practice of brief, sanctioned napping in public or at work, often sitting upright, which is treated as a visible sign of dedication and exhaustion from long hours, not as an optimization strategy. Inemuri exists precisely because chronic short sleep is already a problem in Japanese working life, not because short sleep is considered ideal. Somewhere in the process of being repeated across video after video, a real cultural practice born out of sleep deprivation got rebranded into a method for achieving it on purpose, which is close to the opposite of what it actually represents. The second thing to understand is what sleep researchers actually know about reducing total sleep time, because the body of evidence here is large, consistent, and very different from what the viral version implies. The human need for sleep is not a habit that can be trained away through segmentation. Sleep researchers, including those at Harvard's Division of Sleep Medicine, have documented that adults consistently need between 7 and 9 hours of sleep for normal cognitive function, immune regulation, and emotional stability, and that this requirement does not change based on how the sleep is distributed across the day. Polyphasic sleep schedules, segmented patterns that reduce total sleep significantly below that range, have been studied repeatedly, and the consistent finding is cognitive decline, impaired memory consolidation, and a building sleep debt that does not resolve itself through adaptation, no matter how long the schedule is maintained. A small number of self-experimenters online have claimed otherwise, but none of those claims have held up under controlled study, and several formal investigations into extreme sleep restriction have found measurable impairment in reaction time and decision-making that the subjects themselves often fail to notice, which is its own warning sign, because impaired judgment is part of what makes severe sleep restriction dangerous in the first place. Here's what actually happened during my 14 days, or rather, my 11. The first 2 days, I want to be honest, felt almost like the videos describe, a kind of wired alertness that I mistook for the method working. Sleep researchers have a name for this early phase, and it is not a positive sign, it is the body's acute stress response to sleep deprivation, a temporary surge in cortisol and adrenaline that can feel like energy but is functionally identical to the body treating insufficient sleep as an emergency. By day 4, that surge was gone, and what replaced it was a steady decline I tracked daily. My reaction time, tested with a simple phone-based tool each morning, slowed by roughly 30% compared to my baseline. My mood log, which I rated honestly each evening, showed a clear downward trend, irritability by day 5, genuine low mood by day 8. By day 9 I made 2 significant errors at work, the kind of small but real mistakes, a missed deadline detail and a factual error I normally would have caught immediately, that made the cost of this experiment suddenly feel less like content and more like an actual problem. On day 11, after a night where I caught myself dozing off briefly while driving, stopped safely, and sat in a parked car for 10 minutes before continuing, I ended the experiment. That moment is the reason I am making this video the way I am, rather than the way I originally planned. I want to be direct about that driving moment, because it is the single most important data point from this entire experiment. Drowsy driving research from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has found that the impairment from significant sleep restriction can approach the impairment associated with legal alcohol limits, affecting reaction time, attention, and judgment in ways that are genuinely dangerous, not just inconvenient. A wellness experiment that ends with a driver dozing off, even briefly, even safely managed, is not a method worth recommending to anyone, regardless of what any video claims about Japanese tradition or productivity gains. I also want to address something I noticed in my own thinking during the second week, because I think it is relevant to anyone who has watched videos like the one I originally planned to make. Around day 7 and 8, even as my measurable performance was declining, my subjective sense of how the experiment was going stayed oddly positive for longer than the data supported. This is a documented phenomenon in sleep deprivation research, a kind of impaired self-assessment where sleep-deprived individuals consistently rate their own functioning as better than objective testing shows it to be. It is part of what makes claims like this one so persuasive when repeated online. The people making the claims may genuinely believe their own positive self-report, while the actual cognitive cost is happening underneath their awareness of it. So what is the honest conclusion here? Since I promised you shocking results and the genuinely shocking part is not a productivity hack, it is how far a debunked claim had traveled before I tested it myself. There is no traditional Japanese 4-hour sleep method. What exists in Japan is a well-documented sleep deprivation crisis that the country's own health authorities are actively working to address, and a cultural practice, Inemuri, born from that crisis rather than a solution to anything. What exists in sleep science is decades of consistent evidence that adults need 7 to 9 hours, distributed in one consolidated period for the vast majority of people, and that reducing it through segmentation does not bypass that requirement, it simply accumulates a debt that shows up in reaction time, judgment, and mood, often before the person experiencing it fully notices. If you are watching this because you are exhausted and looking for a shortcut, I understand that completely, because that exhaustion is real and it deserves an answer. But the answer is almost certainly not less sleep arranged differently. If anything, the actual research suggests the opposite direction is worth exploring, protecting a full 7 to 9 hours consistently, and if a midday slump is part of what is driving the search for a shortcut, a short period of genuine daytime rest, the kind grounded in real ultradian rhythm research, is a far better evidenced approach than cutting nighttime sleep into fragments. I am leaving the original footage of my reaction time tests and mood logs available for anyone who wants to see the actual data rather than just my summary of it, because I think the data tells the story more honestly than any single claim I could make about how the 2 weeks felt. What I will not do is tell you to try this yourself, and if you are someone who drives, operates machinery, or is responsible for caring for someone else, I would actively discourage any significant reduction in your sleep, regardless of what method or tradition it is attributed to. If this saved you from trying something I almost convinced myself was a legitimate shortcut, share it with whoever you saw post the original version of this claim. They are very likely making the same mistake I almost did, treating a documented public health problem as if it were a hidden cultural secret. This is Tokyo Horizon. I will see you in the next one, hopefully after we both got a full night of sleep. Why Japanese kitchens have zero counter clutter. I tested it. Here's what happened. Your kitchen counter is not cluttered because you cook a lot or because your kitchen is small. It is cluttered because of a single rule you were never taught, a rule that nearly every Japanese kitchen follows without anyone ever stating it out loud, and one I had genuinely never heard of until I started researching this video. I tested it for 3 weeks in my own kitchen, expecting it to be impossible to maintain, and instead found the opposite, a counter that stayed clear with less daily effort than my old, cluttered counter ever required. Stay with me until the third principle, because that is the one that completely changed how I think about what a counter is even for. Let's start with the rule itself. In Japanese kitchen culture, there is a working principle sometimes summarized as dashipanashi wa shurnai, the avoidance of leaving things out, and it operates on a standard that initially sounds almost unreasonable to a Western home cook. Nothing lives permanently on the counter unless it is used at minimum once a day, every single day, without exception. Not the blender used twice a week. Not the fruit bowl that holds fruit some weeks and dust the others. Not the cutting board that sits out because it might be needed later. The standard is daily use or it goes away, and the first time I read this rule, I assumed my counter would fail it almost completely. It did. 23 separate items lived on my counters before I started this experiment, and by the strict daily use standard, only 4 of them qualified to stay. Before I explain what I removed, I want to explain why this rule exists at all, because it is not really about cleanliness, the same way the bathroom sink habit I have talked about before is not really about cleanliness either. Japanese kitchen counters are typically smaller than Western counters, sometimes dramatically so, and small spaces force a question that large counters let you avoid asking: what does this surface actually need to do? A counter's primary function is to provide open, immediately usable space for food preparation. Every object that sits on it permanently is not neutral, it is actively consuming a portion of that function, whether or not it looks tidy. Architects and kitchen designers studying small Japanese apartments have noted that this forces a kind of functional honesty that larger Western kitchens rarely require, because there is no spare counter to hide an unnecessary toaster on. I had spare counter. I had used it to hide 19 unnecessary objects, and the rule asked me to stop. The first principle, and the easiest to apply immediately, is what I'll call the daily test, applied honestly. For 3 days before changing anything, I simply observed which items on my counter I actually touched, not which ones I assumed I used often, but which ones I physically picked up. My coffee maker, used every single morning, passed. My knife block, used daily, passed. A stand mixer, used roughly twice a month, failed, despite feeling like a kitchen essential because of how much counter space it occupied and how visually prominent it was. A fruit bowl, used inconsistently, failed. A decorative cutting board I had never once actually cut anything on, kept purely for how it looked leaning against the backsplash, failed in the most obvious way possible. The daily test is uncomfortable specifically because it separates what you use from what you simply look at, and most Western kitchen counters, mine included, had quietly become more of the second category than the first. The second principle is what Japanese kitchen organization calls shirmaobasho, literally the place where it goes away, the requirement that every item removed from the counter has an immediate, specific, already existing storage location, not a vague intention to find one eventually. This is where most decluttering attempts fail, in any room, not just the kitchen, because removing an object from a visible surface without a real destination for it just relocates the clutter rather than resolving it. Before I moved a single item off my counter, I identified exactly where each one would live: the stand mixer in the lower cabinet I had been using for serving platters I rarely used, the fruit bowl's contents moved into the refrigerator's produce drawer where fruit actually stays fresher anyway, the decorative cutting board given away entirely because it genuinely had no function beyond decoration. This step took longer than the physical removal, nearly 2 hours of figuring out destinations, but it is the reason the counter has stayed clear for 3 weeks rather than refilling within days the way my previous decluttering attempts always had. The third principle is the one I told you would change how I think about counters entirely, and it is called tadazumai, a word that describes the overall presence or bearing of a space, the impression it gives at a glance before you've consciously analyzed anything in it. Japanese kitchen design treats the counter's tadazumai as something with real value on its own, independent of function, the way a clear horizon line has value independent of any single thing within it. A Western kitchen counter is generally evaluated object by object: is this useful? Does this have a place here? A Japanese kitchen counter is evaluated as a whole first: what does this entire surface communicate at a glance? And individual objects earn their place partly based on whether they preserve or damage that overall impression, not just whether they are independently useful. This reframes the empty space itself as something the counter is providing, not something missing from it. My coffee maker and knife block, both genuinely used daily, still nearly got removed during this process, because even though each passed the daily test individually, having both prominent and visible together changed the counter's tadazumai in a way that felt cluttered despite both items being functionally justified. I ended up tucking the coffee maker into a shallow alcove to one side, keeping it just as accessible but out of the immediate sightline from the kitchen entrance, and the difference in how the whole room felt was larger than I expected from such a small adjustment. Here's what 3 weeks produced, measured as honestly as I could manage. My counter went from 23 permanent items to 4, the coffee maker, the knife block, a single utensil crock, and a small dish soap dispenser, all 4 used multiple times daily without exception. The visible surface area of usable counter space increased by roughly 70%, which I measured with painter's tape before and after, mostly because I did not believe my own eyes the first time I looked at the empty space and wanted a number to check the impression against. But the more interesting result was not the square footage, it was the maintenance time. My old, cluttered counter took an average of 6 minutes to clean and reset each evening, because every object had to be lifted, wiped under, and replaced individually. My new counter, with almost nothing permanently on it, takes 90 seconds, because there is almost nothing to navigate around. Princeton's research on visual clutter and cognitive load, the same research that explains why an unwiped sink quietly taxes attention throughout the day, applies here at a larger scale. A counter with 19 fewer objects in the field of view is a counter that stops asking for small amounts of background attention every time you walk into the kitchen, whether or not you are actively using it. I also want to mention the part of this experiment that genuinely surprised me, which is how little I missed the items I removed. I expected at least a few moments of frustration, reaching for the stand mixer and feeling annoyed it was now in a cabinet instead of ready on the counter. It happened exactly twice in 3 weeks, and both times the actual retrieval took under 10 seconds, a cost so small it did not come close to offsetting the daily benefit of not navigating around it for the other 20 days I did not use it. The Western instinct toward counter convenience optimizes for the rare moment of use at the cost of constant, low-grade obstruction during all the much more frequent moments of non-use. And once I saw that trade laid out honestly, item by item, the decision to put things away stopped feeling like a sacrifice. There is a reason this rule produces zero clutter specifically, rather than just less clutter, and I think it comes down to the standard being binary rather than gradual. Most Western decluttering advice operates on a spectrum: reduce what you can, simplify where possible, which leaves enormous room for judgment calls that tend to favor keeping things. The Japanese daily use standard is a clean binary, use today or not, which removes the negotiation entirely. There is no judgment call to make about the stand mixer once the rule is simply does it get touched today, because the answer on most days is no, and the rule does not ask for an exception. So here is everything in one breath. Nothing earns permanent counter space unless it is genuinely used at least once a day, tested honestly rather than assumed. Every item removed needs a real, already existing place to go, not a vague intention to find one later. And the counter as a whole is evaluated for its overall impression, its tatazumai, not just object by object, which sometimes means relocating even a daily use item if its visibility is working against the calm of the whole room. Now I want to hear from you. Walk into your kitchen and count how many items on your counter you have genuinely touched today, not this week, today. Tell me the number in the comments. If it's under 5, you are already closer to a Japanese kitchen counter than you think. If it's over 15, like mine was, you already know exactly where your cleaning time has been going. And if this made you think of someone whose counter you have quietly judged every time you visited their kitchen, send them this video instead of the comment you've been holding back. They might be one honest afternoon away from a counter that finally gives them back the space it was always supposed to provide. This is Tokyo Horizon. I will see you in the next one.